I never thought a forgotten pair of pajamas could lead to something like this. We were just two friends going on a trip. Nothing romantic, nothing complicated. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. But life has a strange way of sneaking emotions into the quietest moments, like shadows slipping in through a half-closed door. I remember the day we left. The sky was a pale gray, not gloomy, just soft, like it was undecided between sun or rain. He showed up late, as usual, dragging his duffel bag with that same lazy grin that somehow always made people forgive him. I was already waiting in the car, engine running, backpack loaded, Spotify playing something mellow. "Sorry," he said, tossing his bag in the back seat. "Had to wrestle my laundry off the dryer." I laughed. "You know we're only going for 3 days, right? 3 days of freedom." He smiled, buckling up beside me. "No work. No drama. Just peace." I should have known better. Peace wasn't exactly what this trip had planned for us. We planned the getaway for weeks. A quiet cabin up in the hills, surrounded by pine trees and silence. No internet. Barely any phone signal. It was meant to be a reset, a break from city noise, stress, and pretending. It was always easy between us, or so I thought. No pressure, just comfort. But that first night, everything began to shift in ways I didn't expect. We arrived just before sunset. The cabin was smaller than the pictures made it look, but cozy, wooden walls, a fireplace, 2 beds pushed to opposite sides of the room. He immediately ran to check the kitchen like a kid on a field trip. "This place is awesome," he yelled from the pantry. I nodded, standing at the doorway, feeling the chill of the evening slide in behind me. After dinner, we unpacked. I remember I was folding my t-shirts when he suddenly stopped, staring into his bag like something important had gone missing. "Crap," he muttered. "What?" I asked, turning toward him. He lifted his head slowly, almost sheepishly. "I forgot my pajamas." For a second, there was silence. Then I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so typical of him. Forgetful, spontaneous, careless with details. "You're kidding." "Wish I was," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "I swear I packed them, but I guess they never made it in." He didn't look embarrassed exactly, just uncertain. Like he wasn't sure how I'd react. "There's a blanket on the couch," I offered. "Could wrap yourself in that." He grinned, that half-laugh that always softened his mistakes. "Nah, I'll just sleep in my boxers. No big deal." And then, after a beat, "Unless you don't mind sharing yours?" He said it casually, like a joke, but his eyes searched mine a little longer than usual. My throat tightened slightly, and I turned back to my bag, pretending to fuss with something. Yeah? I mean, sure. They're loose anyway. Should be fine." "Cool," he said, stretching like it was the end of the day. "I'll shower first." I watched him walk away, my heart suddenly pacing faster. I wasn't sure why. It was just pajamas, right? Just one friend helping another. Nothing strange. Nothing different. But something had cracked open in that moment, something quiet and curious. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the folded pajamas in my hand longer than necessary. When he came out of the bathroom, hair damp, towel draped around his neck, I felt that same weird electricity in the air. He looked at the pajamas in my hand, smiled. "Thanks, man." I nodded, trying not to look directly at him as I handed them over. Our fingers brushed for half a second. I felt it. He did too. He didn't say anything, just took the clothes and changed quickly while I pretended to check my phone that didn't even have a signal. That night, he slipped into bed on the other side of the room wearing my clothes, and I lay under my blanket, facing the ceiling, listening to the sound of his breathing. Slow, calm. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I remembered the brush of his fingers, the softness of his voice when he asked if I'd share. There was a warmth in my chest that made no sense, a nervousness that hadn't been there before. This was my best friend. We'd known each other for years. We'd crashed on each other's couches, shared snacks, secrets, even heartbreaks. But this felt different. And I didn't know why. Or maybe I did. Maybe I was just too scared to admit it. Around 2 in the morning, I turned to my side and peeked over. He was asleep, one arm flung across the bed, breathing steady. The pajamas hung loose on him, and for some reason, the sight made my heart tighten. I closed my eyes again, trying to ignore it. Trying to forget the way his voice had sounded when he said he didn't mind. Trying not to feel the pull in my chest when I remembered that soft moment. It was just pajamas. Just one night. That's what I kept telling myself. Over and over. Until I finally drifted off, with 1,000 questions I wasn't ready to ask myself echoing in the back of my mind. The morning came quietly. Light crept through the gaps in the curtains, painting soft stripes across the wooden floor. I woke up before him. My body still, but my mind turning fast. I didn't move at first. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling again, listening to the quiet rhythm of his breath. He was still asleep, curled toward the window, one leg pulled up slightly, my pajama shirt hanging loose on his shoulder. It should have felt normal. It should have felt like any other morning after a long trip. But it didn't. Something had shifted inside me, and I couldn't quite name it yet. I turned my head slowly to look at him. He looked peaceful, completely unaware of the storm in my chest. There was something about seeing someone like that, unguarded, calm, breathing softly in your clothes, that made everything feel more complicated than it needed to be. I closed my eyes, willing myself to stop thinking. It was just a moment. It didn't mean anything. I kept telling myself that, like repeating it enough times would make it true. When he finally stirred, I was already up, pretending to scroll through photos on my phone. He stretched, his voice rough with sleep. Morning. I turned slightly, offered him a smile I wasn't sure looked right. Sleep okay? He nodded, rubbing his eyes. Yeah, your pajamas are actually pretty comfortable. I laughed a little, trying to keep it light. Told you. He yawned and sat up, the blanket falling around his waist. Thanks again for letting me borrow them. It's nothing, I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on the screen. Just pajamas. But it didn't feel like nothing. Not anymore. There was this odd awareness between us now. A kind of quiet that felt heavier than usual. We moved through the morning with this weird sort of politeness. We cooked breakfast together, side by side like we always had, but there was a gap between our movements that hadn't been there before. A pause before we handed each other the salt. A second of hesitation when our hands almost touched again. He didn't bring it up. I didn't either. But I could feel it. The silence said more than words ever could. After we ate, he stepped outside to breathe in the cold morning air. I stayed back, clearing plates, pretending to focus on washing the same dish 3 times. I glanced at him through the window, barefoot on the porch, arms crossed, staring into the trees. I didn't know what he was thinking. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. The night kept playing over in my head. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. The way I had felt the air change. The strange, sudden awareness of him. I stepped out eventually. You okay? I asked, pretending I didn't notice the far-off look in his eyes. He nodded. Yeah. Just weird being somewhere this quiet, you know? I nodded too, even though I knew that wasn't all he meant. There was quiet between us now too, not just around us. Inside the moments we didn't know how to fill. We spent the afternoon hiking. It was something we'd planned to do since we booked the place. Trails through old forests, moss-covered rocks, and air that smelled clean and sharp. We didn't talk much. A few jokes here and there, some teasing about who was slower, but there was space between our words. And in that space, all I could think about was the way he had looked at me last night. The softness in his voice. The comfort he showed with me that he didn't show with anyone else. At one point, we stopped by a creek. He bent down to splash water on his face, and I watched him, wondering if he was thinking about it too. If he felt the shift, the change, the way I did. He stood, shaking off the water, and smiled at me. It was the kind of smile that felt familiar, but now it made my stomach twist. I smiled back too quickly, afraid he'd see through it. We made it back to the cabin before dark. I was tired, but it wasn't just physical. My thoughts had been running all day, turning over little moments, tiny things I wouldn't have noticed before. The way he stood closer now. The way he lingered when he laughed. Maybe I was reading into everything. Maybe I was just confused. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had started the moment I gave him those pajamas, and neither of us knew what to do with it. That night, after dinner, we sat by the fireplace. He was wearing my pajama pants again. He hadn't asked this time. He just pulled them on like it was already understood. I said nothing, but inside, something stirred. We talked about dumb things, movies, college memories, old friends, but every time his eyes met mine, I felt this warmth grow in my chest. It wasn't loud or sudden. It was quiet, slow. Like water rising without you noticing, until you're already standing knee-deep in something you can't step out of. He leaned back in the armchair, legs stretched out, eyes half closed. I could live like this, he said softly. No traffic. No noise. Just this. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Yeah, it's peaceful. He looked over at me. You ever think about what life would be like if we just stayed out here? Like, didn't go back? My heart jumped, just slightly. I looked at him carefully. Why? You thinking about disappearing on everyone? He smiled. Maybe. Maybe not. Just thinking. I wanted to ask him what he really meant. But I didn't. I wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, I threw another log on the fire and watched the sparks fly up into the chimney. He eventually stood, stretching his arms. Gonna crash early tonight. Beat from the hike. I nodded. Yeah, same. As we both got ready for bed, he took my pajama top from the chair without asking, pulling it over his head. I felt something flutter in my stomach. He looked at me, not saying a word. Just a look. Quiet, but lingering. We lay in bed, lights out, only the fire crackling faintly in the other room. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. I wasn't sure anymore. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept returning to that look. That pause. That question in his eyes that neither of us dared to voice. In the stillness, everything was louder. Every breath. Every thought. Every emotion I had been trying to bury. And somewhere in the dark, I realized this wasn't about pajamas anymore. The darkness felt heavier that night. The kind that doesn't just sit outside your window, but wraps itself around your chest, slow and pressing. I lay there, staring into the ceiling again, even though I couldn't see it. My ears tuned into every small sound, the shifting of his blanket, the soft rustle as he adjusted his position, the way his breathing would change slightly whenever he turned over. He wasn't asleep yet. I could tell. He was still, like I was. Still, but too awake. too aware. The fire in the other room had died down by then, but its glow had left just enough warmth for the silence to stretch between us without becoming cold. We hadn't said goodnight. We hadn't needed to. Words felt too fragile now. Anything said might tip something over we couldn't undo. I rolled to my side slowly, facing the edge of my bed closest to his. I could barely make out his shape in the dark, curled up, one hand under his head, the hem of my pajama shirt riding slightly up his back. That sight alone stirred something I didn't have a name for yet. I tried to make sense of it. He was my best friend. Always had been. We'd done everything together. Been through late-night study sessions, heartbreaks, parties, hangovers, even fights. But never this. Never this silence that felt thick with questions either of us were ready to ask. It wasn't about the clothes anymore. It wasn't even about the touch from the night before. It was about everything that came after. The way his eyes looked at me. The way he wore my things like he didn't have to ask anymore. Like he belonged there. And my mind kept drifting back to our hike earlier. The way he had looked out into the trees, quiet but thoughtful. His question, what if we didn't go back, kept replaying. Not just the words, but the way he said them. Soft. Slow. Like he was testing the weight of something he wasn't sure he could carry. It wasn't just about the forest, the cabin, or the peace. It felt like he was reaching for something, maybe someone. And I'd been too scared to reach back. I wanted to say something. Anything. Just a word. But my throat stayed tight, and my lips didn't move. I didn't even know what I would have said. Are you thinking about it too? Did something shift for you? Is this more than friendship now? The questions were real. The emotions were real. But speaking them felt too dangerous. Like saying it out loud would make it permanent, would change everything between us. Whether for better or worse, I wasn't sure. The risk of ruining what we already had kept me frozen. Eventually, I heard him whisper, "You still awake?" His voice was barely there. Just a breath across the dark. My heart jumped at the sound, but I kept my voice steady. "Yeah." A pause. Then, "Can I ask you something?" My stomach flipped, and I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. "Sure," I replied, trying to sound casual. But the pause that followed told me he was thinking hard about how to say it. "Do you remember last year, when we went to the lake house?" I blinked into the dark. "Yeah. Of course. What about it?" He hesitated again. "You remember that night we got drunk and fell asleep on the dock?" I smiled faintly at the memory. "Yeah. You fell in the water halfway through the night." He chuckled softly. "Yeah, I did. But before that, before I passed out, I almost said something to you." His words hit like a quiet thud in my chest. I swallowed. "What kind of something?" Another long pause. I could almost feel the tension on his side of the room, just as sharp as mine. "I don't know. Just something real. I don't even remember exactly. I just remember feeling something I didn't want to admit. And I was scared. Still am, maybe." The air between us changed. The weight in the room grew heavier. But not in a bad way. More like something sacred. Something raw. I turned fully to face him now, even though I still couldn't see his face clearly. "You can tell me," I said, my voice low. "Whatever it was." He didn't answer at first. I heard him shift, his breath catching slightly like he'd been holding it. "You remember that joke earlier? About sharing pajamas?" "Yeah. It wasn't a joke." His voice broke on the edge of those words. I felt like the air had left the room. My chest ached from holding in too much emotion. I didn't know how to respond. Every thought in my head collided at once, relief, confusion, fear, warmth. I wanted to say the right thing, but I didn't even know what that was. So I said the only truth I had. It didn't feel like a joke. Silence again. Then I heard him exhale, slow and deep, like something inside him had loosened. I've been trying to ignore this for a while. Whatever this is. Between us. I didn't want to make things weird. It's already weird, I said with a nervous laugh. But it's okay. I feel it too. There it was. The truth we'd both been circling finally spoken, floating between us like fog in the dark. No dramatic music. No fireworks. Just quiet honesty. And it was heavier than anything I'd ever said. I heard his sheets shift, like he turned toward me too. What do we do now? He asked. I stared into the dark, the ache in my chest softening into something warmer. I don't know. But maybe we stop pretending. He didn't respond for a long time. But then I felt it. The calm. The silence, no longer tense, but peaceful. Like we'd crossed something invisible and landed somewhere softer. Safer. We didn't touch. We didn't get up. We didn't kiss or hug or do anything dramatic. We just stayed there, in our own beds, breathing together, knowing that nothing between us was simple anymore. But that maybe, just maybe, it didn't have to be hidden either. That night, I finally slept, not because everything made sense, but because the lie we'd been living had started to unravel, and in its place, something honest was beginning to grow. Something fragile. Something real. The morning light filtered into the room like a soft whisper, gentle and slow, casting warm lines across the wooden walls. I opened my eyes to the sound of birds outside and the faint creak of the cabin settling. For a few seconds I forgot where I was. But then everything from the night before came rushing back. His voice in the dark. His words. It wasn't a joke. And mine, barely more than a breath. I feel it too. I lay still, the weight of that moment pressing against my chest again, not heavy in a painful way, but thick with meaning. Something had changed, and there was no going back now. I could hear him moving softly in his bed across the room, and that alone was enough to send a wave of nervous electricity through me. We hadn't said anything more after that final exchange. We hadn't needed to. But now, in the daylight, with reality washing in through the windows, I wondered what would come next. I turned my head to look at him. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, back to me, hunched slightly like he was deep in thought. His hair was messy from sleep, and he wore the same pajama shirt he'd borrowed. My pajama shirt. The sight made my chest tighten. It was such a small thing, but it felt intimate now. Personal. Like a secret worn in plain sight. I sat up slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Hey," I said softly. He glanced over his shoulder, his face unreadable for a second. Then he smiled, tentative, shy, like we were meeting for the first time. "Hey." Just that one word. But something in it settled the nervous flurry inside me. We both got up and started moving around the room, brushing our teeth, making the beds, pretending to focus on normal tasks. But the air between us was anything but normal. It was filled with glances held just a little too long, brushes of fingers that lingered more than they should, the silence stretched tight with everything we weren't saying yet. At breakfast, he poured coffee for both of us without asking, like he'd done it 100 times before. But when he handed me the mug, our fingers touched again, and this time neither of us pulled away quickly. The touch was soft, brief, but deliberate. We locked eyes for a second longer than was comfortable, and then he smiled, looking down at his plate like he couldn't quite meet my gaze. We didn't talk about what happened. Not directly. But it lived between every word. In the way he laughed a little too hard at my jokes. In the way I watched him a little too closely when he spoke. In the way we kept moving around each other like magnets that didn't know whether to push or pull. I could feel the questions rising inside me. What are we doing? What does this mean? Is this real or just a moment built from loneliness and borrowed clothes? But I didn't ask. I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, we cleaned up breakfast and headed outside. The day was brighter than the one before. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and the trail leading away from the cabin looked inviting. We grabbed our jackets and started walking, side by side, hands tucked in our pockets, shoulders occasionally bumping as the path narrowed out. We walked in silence for a while, the crunch of leaves under our feet the only sound between us. Then he spoke, voice soft but steady. I've been thinking about last night. My heart jumped, but I kept my voice even. Yeah? He nodded. I meant what I said. I've been feeling this for a while. I just didn't know how to say it. I swallowed, glancing at him from the corner of my eye. Why didn't you? He hesitated, eyes on the ground. Because I was scared you'd look at me differently. Or worse, that I'd ruin everything. I stopped walking. So did he. The forest around us went still, like it was holding its breath. And now? I asked. Now that it's out in the open? He looked at me then, really looked. His eyes weren't nervous anymore. They were serious, deep, and open in a way that made me feel completely seen. Now I'm still scared, he said. But it feels better than pretending. At least now I know I'm not alone in this. I took a slow step closer to him, the cold air sharp between us. You're not, I said. I've felt it too. I just didn't know if I was making it up in my head. If I was reading into things that weren't there. His lips parted slightly like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Instead, he reached out and gently touched my sleeve. Not a grab, not a pull, just a light, tentative touch, enough to send a wave of warmth down my spine. We stood like that for a moment. Close but not close enough. And then I spoke quietly. I don't know what happens next, but I want to figure it out. His hand slid from my sleeve to my fingers, brushing softly. Me too, he whispered. The touch wasn't bold. It wasn't dramatic. It was careful. Tender. But it said everything we couldn't say. We didn't kiss. We didn't make any promises. We just stood there, holding each other's gaze, hands barely linked, in the middle of the woods. And somehow, that moment felt more intimate than anything I'd ever known. The rest of the hike passed in a blur of shared looks and soft conversations. We talked about childhood memories, embarrassing moments from high school, stupid things we did in college. But underneath it all was something new, an undercurrent of vulnerability that hadn't been there before. When we got back to the cabin, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. We were quiet as we stepped inside, both of us acutely aware that the walls around us now held something different. We weren't the same people who had arrived here 2 days ago. Something had opened. Something had shifted. And now, we had to decide what we were going to do with it. He pulled off his jacket and tossed it onto the chair. He looked over at me, eyes softer than I'd ever seen them. I'm not good at this, he said. Whatever this is. I smiled gently. Neither am I. But maybe we don't have to be. He looked at me for a long time, then nodded. Okay. He walked over, slow and unsure, and sat down beside me on the couch. Our shoulders touched, and neither of us moved away. The fire had burned low again, casting a faint orange glow over the room. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees. Inside, everything felt quiet. But this time, it wasn't a silence of distance. It was a silence of comfort, of understanding, of two people who were finally starting to admit the truth they'd both been hiding for too long. That we didn't say anything else that night. We just sat there, side by side, our shoulders pressed together, the air warm between us, and the weight of the past 2 nights slowly giving way to something lighter. Something honest. Something real. And though we didn't speak it out loud, I think we both knew this was no longer just a trip. This was the beginning of something neither of us had expected, but maybe, in some quiet part of ourselves, had always hoped for. The morning after felt different, like something inside both of us had shifted without us needing to talk about it. The air was the same, the light streaming through the curtains was soft and golden, and yet there was a calmness between us that hadn't been there before. No tension, no nervous hesitation. Just silence, the good kind. The kind where you don't need to fill the space with noise because your presence says enough. I woke up first again, but this time I didn't rush to pretend like I was doing something else. I sat up slowly, still under the blanket, and just looked around the room. The cabin felt warmer, even with the fire out. Maybe it was the lingering heat from the night before, or maybe it was just that something unspoken had finally started to feel real between us. He stirred not long after. His hair was messy again, and his face still soft from sleep. He blinked slowly, eyes meeting mine across the room. And instead of pretending to be casual or looking away like we used to, he held my gaze. No words, just a shared moment of quiet understanding. Then he smiled, small, lopsided, the kind that said everything without saying anything. I smiled back, my heart thudding a little too hard in my chest. "Sleep okay?" I asked, my voice low, still hushed by the morning. He nodded. "Yeah. Better than I expected." There was a pause before he added, "It feels nice, not having to hide anything anymore." I nodded too, even though I wasn't entirely sure what we were yet. All I knew was that we were something. More than before. More than friends, maybe. Less than lovers, not yet. But something. After breakfast, we decided to head into the nearby town. There was a small grocery store, a couple of local shops, and a diner that looked like it hadn't changed since the 70s. We wanted to grab some extra snacks and maybe stretch our legs. The town was quiet, sleepy, with only a few cars passing by and locals sipping coffee on wooden porches. It was the kind of place where time felt slower, like people still cared about looking each other in the eye when they spoke. As we walked through the aisles of the store, something strange happened. I caught myself looking at him differently. Not just noticing him, like a friend would, but observing him. Watching the way his fingers tapped on a box of cereal, the way he bent slightly to read a label, the way his eyes scanned the shelves like he was trying to make the most responsible snack decision of his life. It was stupid, probably, but I liked watching him. I liked being near him. And when he turned and caught me staring, he didn't say anything. He just smiled, like he'd caught me in a secret I didn't mind being found out for. On our way back, he nudged me with his shoulder. "You've been quiet." "Just thinking," I said. "About what?" I hesitated, then gave a half smile. "About us." His expression shifted slightly, not in fear, but in that way where someone suddenly becomes more present, more grounded. "Me too," he said. We walked a little slower after that. I don't know if either of us noticed it at first, but our arms brushed more than once. And then, somewhere along the gravel path back to the cabin, his fingers brushed mine. Not by accident. Not quickly. But gently. A slow, deliberate touch. And then he took my hand. Just like that. No warning. No explanation. And I didn't pull away. I didn't even flinch. I just let it happen. My hand slid into his like it had always belonged there. It was the first time he'd ever touched me like that, on purpose, with meaning. And it felt like the world narrowed into that one moment, like the trees faded out, the sounds of birds softened, and all that existed was the warmth of his palm against mine. We didn't speak. We just kept walking, hands entwined, steps steady. When we reached the cabin, we let go without saying a word. But everything had been said already. Later that afternoon, we made hot chocolate and sat on the porch, watching the wind stir the tops of the trees. He leaned his head back against the wooden railing and closed his eyes, the sun hitting his face. I watched him in that moment, and something inside me ached in the most unexpected way. Not painful. Not sad. Just full. So full it felt like I didn't know how to carry it all. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was rich, filled with unspoken words, half-finished thoughts, and feelings we were slowly learning how to name. Eventually, he opened his eyes and looked at me. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course," I said. He took a breath. "Did you ever feel this way about anyone else? Before me?" I looked away for a second, the question catching me off guard, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I'd never allowed myself to think about it deeply. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I think maybe I did. But I didn't recognize it for what it was. I pushed it down, ignored it, convinced myself it was something else. You're the first person who made me stop lying to myself." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable but soft. "Same." A pause. "I've always known, in some way. But I never thought I'd actually let myself feel it. Especially not with you." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and that did something to me. I reached out, placed my hand over his, just resting there, not forcing anything. "We're here now," I said. "Whatever this is, we're in it together." He squeezed my hand gently, and that was all the answer I needed. That night, something changed again. We didn't talk about it. We didn't plan it. But when it was time to go to bed, he didn't go to his side of the room. He paused in front of my bed, silent. I looked up at him, heart thudding, unsure. But then he sat down beside me, pulled the blanket slightly, and without a word, lay down facing me. There was barely enough space, but neither of us cared. We didn't touch at first. Just looked at each other in the dark. His breath was slow. Mine matched his. And when his hand finally reached for mine under the blanket, I didn't hesitate. I met him there. No questions. No labels. Just warmth and understanding. We fell asleep like that. Fingers intertwined. Hearts calm. And for the first time since the trip started, I didn't feel confused. I didn't feel afraid. I felt seen. I felt safe. And above all, I felt home. The night passed slower than usual, but in a way that felt comforting, not restless. We didn't talk much after he climbed into my bed. We didn't need to. Lying side by side, our bodies close under the same blanket, said more than 100 carefully chosen words ever could. There was something fragile about the way our fingers remained gently linked under the covers, like either of us wanted to hold too tight, as if this connection, this moment, might shatter if we moved wrong. And yet, despite the quiet, there was no tension, no fear, just a steady warmth that made my chest feel full in a way I wasn't used to. For a long time, I stared at the ceiling in the dark, not because I was uncertain anymore, but because I couldn't stop thinking about how surreal it all felt. Him, here. With me. Not just physically close, but emotionally, undeniably open. The wall between us was gone now, and the space that had been filled with assumptions and silence was replaced with something real and mutual and almost unbearably soft. At some point, I must have drifted into sleep because I woke up to the feeling of sunlight on my face and the gentle sound of birds again. His arm was over my waist. His forehead was resting lightly against my shoulder. And my first thought wasn't to pull away, or panic, or question it. My first thought was, I didn't want it to end. I lay still, eyes barely open, and just let myself feel that moment. His breath was slow and steady, warm against the side of my neck. His fingers twitched slightly against my shirt, and I could feel the subtle rise and fall of his chest against my back. It was simple. It was quiet. But it felt monumental. When he finally stirred, I didn't move. I felt him pull his arm back slowly, like he wasn't sure if I was awake, or if he'd crossed a line in his sleep. But then I turned slightly, just enough to meet his eyes. He looked unsure, maybe a little embarrassed. But I gave him a small smile, just enough to say, "It's okay." He looked relieved, even if he didn't say it out loud. "Morning," he whispered, his voice rough from sleep. "Morning," I replied, voice just as soft. There was a pause. Then he added, "Did I overstep?" I shook my head. "Not at all." He looked at me for a long moment, and then he smiled, genuine, unguarded. "Good. Because I didn't want to let go." We got up a little slower that day. Everything about the morning moved at a different pace. We took turns in the shower, made breakfast together, and talked about normal things, what we might do with the rest of the day, what snacks we had left, how cold it had gotten during the night. But beneath every casual word, there was a softness that hadn't been there before. A closeness that made even the most ordinary things feel significant. At one point, while I was flipping eggs in the pan, he stepped behind me to grab a plate, and his hand brushed against the small of my back. I felt the touch linger, just for a moment longer than necessary. And when I turned to look at him, he didn't pull away. He just smiled, like he was still trying to believe this was real too. We spent the afternoon sitting on the porch again, wrapped in blankets and sipping warm tea. The wind had picked up, making the trees sway gently in the distance, and there was a calm stillness to everything around us. He leaned his head against my shoulder, and I let mine rest on top of his. Neither of us spoke for a while. We just listened, to the wind, to the birds, to each other's quiet breaths. And then, out of nowhere, he said, "I'm scared." I didn't move. I didn't say anything right away. I just waited. After a few seconds, he added, "Not because I regret anything. I don't. But because what we're doing, it feels too good to be real. And I don't want to lose it." His honesty didn't surprise me. He'd always been the kind to speak his fears once he found the space to do it. What surprised me was how much I needed to hear it. Because I felt the same. "I'm scared too," I said quietly. "But maybe that means it's worth holding on to. If it didn't matter, it wouldn't feel this terrifying." He nodded slowly, his cheek brushing against my shoulder. I never expected this. Not with you. Not here. Not like this." "Neither did I," I whispered. "But I'm glad it happened." The rest of the day unfolded like a quiet dream. We played cards at the table, made jokes about who cheated the most, and cooked dinner together like we'd been doing it for years. Everything felt easy, natural. But every so often, our hands would find each other's. Not because we were trying to be romantic or make a statement, but because it felt right. It felt necessary. Like we were still trying to understand this invisible string that had always been pulling us together, even before we realized it existed. That night, when it was time for bed again, he didn't ask. He didn't pause in front of his bed like he had the night before. He just followed me to mine, climbed under the blanket beside me, and exhaled like he'd finally made peace with whatever doubt had still lingered. We didn't hold each other immediately. We just lay there, facing each other, eyes open in the dark, sharing the same space. "I don't want this to end when we leave," he said softly. "I don't want to go back to pretending." "We won't," I said, more certain than I had been in days. "We'll figure it out." He reached for my hand under the blanket again, his fingers lacing with mine. "Promise?" I looked at him, eyes adjusting to the dark enough to make out the shape of his face, the softness in his expression. "Promise." There was no fear in his eyes this time. Only trust. Only something tender and real and open. He moved a little closer, our foreheads almost touching now. "I wish I'd told you sooner," he whispered. "Me too," I replied. And for the first time, the silence between us didn't just feel like comfort, it felt like love. Not loud or dramatic or rushed. Just steady. Quiet. Growing. And as we drifted off to sleep again, I knew that no matter what came after this trip, no matter how complicated the world outside the cabin might be, something had changed between us forever. Something we could never unfeel. Something that, in the most unexpected way, had finally begun to feel like home. The final morning in the cabin came with a strange, slow ache that started before I even opened my eyes. It wasn't the physical kind of ache, not from sleep or movement, but something more emotional, like a quiet sadness creeping in from the edges. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to get up and face what today meant. This place, this small wooden cabin in the middle of nowhere, had become a shelter for us, our temporary universe where time slowed down, and the outside world didn't exist. In here, it was just us. Honest, stripped down, finally able to be who we were without all the noise. But now that peace was about to be interrupted. The thought of going back to real life, to people who knew us only as best friends, to routines that didn't have room for whatever this had become, filled me with a kind of dread I didn't know how to explain. I felt him shift beside me, the mattress creaking quietly as he turned onto his side. I didn't move. I just waited. His hand found mine under the blanket, like it had done for the past 2 nights. And without needing to say a word, we both knew we were thinking the same thing. Leaving meant change. And change was scary. He didn't speak right away. He just lay there, our fingers gently tangled, his thumb rubbing slow circles over the back of my hand. It was such a small gesture, but it held so much tenderness. I turned my head to look at him. His eyes were open already, staring up at the wooden beams on the ceiling, his jaw tense like he was trying to hold something in. I spoke first. "So, last day." He nodded. "Yeah. I was hoping that maybe if I didn't acknowledge it, it wouldn't be real." I tried to smile, but it came out weak. "Same." We both sat up eventually, slowly, like getting out of bed was somehow breaking the spell that had been cast over us. The room looked different now. Not physically, but emotionally. The bags in the corner that we hadn't touched in days were suddenly reminders that this was all temporary. I went to the window, pulled the curtain aside, and stared at the trees outside. They looked the same as every other day, but today they felt like they were saying goodbye. "Do you think it'll be different when we go back?" I asked without turning around. He stayed quiet for a moment. "Yeah. It probably will." I closed my eyes and sighed. "I don't want it to be." "Me neither," he said, his voice barely audible behind me. "But we can't stay in this cabin forever." I finally turned to face him. He was sitting at the edge of the bed, hands clasped between his knees, shoulders slightly hunched. He looked unsure again. Like the confidence he had built up over the last few days was starting to unravel now that reality was inching its way back in. "What are we going to do?" I asked, my voice cracking more than I wanted it to. He looked up at me, and for a second, he looked just as lost as I felt. "I don't know. I mean, I know how I feel. That hasn't changed. But outside of here, everything's different. People see us differently. They have expectations." I walked over and sat beside him, close enough for our knees to touch. "What if we stopped worrying about what other people see? What if we just focused on what this is for us?" He looked at me then, really looked. "Can we do that?" "I think we have to," I said more firmly this time. "Because if we don't, we'll end up pretending again. And I don't want to go back to pretending." He nodded slowly, his eyes heavy with emotion. "I don't either." We spent the morning packing in silence. Every item folded and zipped into bags felt like we were putting pieces of this week into storage, trying to preserve it, to keep it untouched. Every moment felt final. The way he folded his hoodie. The way I sealed the bag of leftover snacks. Even brushing our teeth side by side felt more emotional than it had any right to. At one point, he found the shirt I had let him borrow on the first night and held it up with a small smile. "Think I should return this, or keep it as a souvenir?" I looked at him, then at the shirt. "Keep it. Maybe it'll remind you that this wasn't just a dream." We didn't leave right away. We sat on the porch for a long time, watching the wind shake the branches like they were waving us off. He leaned into me, and I wrapped my arm around his shoulders. We didn't talk much. Just stayed like that, pressed together, clinging to the last few drops of peace. Then, out of nowhere, he whispered, "Do you think people will understand?" I didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they'd be confused. Maybe they'd judge or gossip or say things that would make this harder. But I also knew that what we had here was real. And if it was real, it was worth protecting. "Maybe not," I said honestly. "But I don't need them to understand. I just need you to be with me in it." He turned his head toward me. "I am." I met his eyes. "Then that's all that matters." We didn't cry. Not then. But the emotion sat heavy between us. Not in a painful way, but in that way where your heart knows you're about to leave something special behind. When it was finally time to go, we stood in the doorway of the cabin for a long time, looking back at the space that had been ours. It felt smaller now, like it was holding its breath, waiting for us to say goodbye. He reached for my hand again. "Ready?" he asked. "No," I said truthfully. "But let's go anyway." We walked out together, the cabin door closing softly behind us, the sound echoing through the trees. We loaded the car in silence, the trunk clicking shut with a finality that stung. As we pulled out onto the dirt road, the trees passed by like memories. And somewhere deep in my chest, I felt that ache again, the one that comes when something beautiful ends, but leaves something even more important behind. A beginning. A truth. A promise we didn't yet know how to carry, but one we were willing to try. That he reached over and rested his hand on mine while I drove. Just that. A touch. But it said everything. We weren't going back to who we were. Not really. We were going forward, into something unknown, uncertain, but real. And for the first time, uncertainty didn't scare me. Because he was still there beside me. And that, somehow, made all the difference. The road back home felt longer than it had on the way there. Trees blurred past the windows like a slideshow of memories we weren't ready to let go of. The radio played low in the background, but we weren't really listening. Every so often, I'd glance at him sitting in the passenger seat, fingers resting loosely in his lap, gaze fixed on the passing woods. He hadn't said much since we left the cabin, and I didn't push him to. I was still processing everything too. The silence between us now was different, not tense, not awkward, but full. Full of everything we'd shared, everything we'd admitted, everything that still felt too big to put into words. Even so, there was a comfort in his presence. Knowing he was there beside me, even as we headed back toward the world that didn't yet know what had happened between us, kept me grounded. By the time we reached the city limits, the trees had been replaced by traffic lights, billboards, and the low hum of life buzzing back into our ears. We passed familiar streets, fast food joints, and stores we used to stop at together. It was like stepping back into our old selves, except we weren't the same anymore. That was the strange part. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt like it did before. And I knew, as I pulled onto the street leading to his place, that this was the real test. Not the quiet of the cabin. Not the shared bed or the whispered confessions. This. Right here. The real world. Friends, coworkers, family. People who had known us as something else. People who never questioned how close we were because they never had a reason to doubt. I parked the car outside his apartment. Neither of us moved right away. We sat in the car, the engine ticking softly as it cooled down. He looked over at me, eyes unreadable but heavy with thought. "Do you think this changes everything?" he asked finally, voice low. I took a breath. "It already has." He nodded slowly, but he looked nervous, like he was teetering on the edge of something. "I mean, with people. With us. Out there." I turned to him, meeting his eyes. "I don't know what people will say. I don't know if they'll understand. But I know what we have. And I know that pretending like nothing happened, like we didn't feel any of it, that would hurt a hell of a lot more than whatever comes next." He looked down, then back at me, and for a moment, he just stared. Then he reached out and placed his hand on mine, like he'd done so many times in the last few days, only now it felt different, more exposed. Not hidden in the safety of the woods, but out here, under the dull light of a city street. "What do we tell people?" he asked. I squeezed his hand gently. "We don't have to tell them anything yet. We just be us. However that looks now. We take our time." He nodded again. There was still fear in his eyes, but less than before. And I knew it wasn't because he doubted how he felt. It was because the world wasn't always kind to what it didn't expect. He opened the door and stepped out, then leaned in before closing it. "You coming up?" "In a bit," I said. "Just need a minute." He paused, then leaned down and kissed my cheek, soft, quick, but enough to make my breath catch. "Don't disappear on me," he said. I smiled. "Not going anywhere." He nodded once more and walked into his building. I watched until he disappeared behind the glass doors, then leaned back in my seat, eyes closed. Everything was changing. I could feel it in my bones. The next few days moved like a strange blend of normal and surreal. We texted constantly, like always, but now the tone was different. Softer. More careful. Every message held an echo of the things we hadn't said out loud in the daylight yet. We hung out like we used to, grabbing food, watching dumb shows, playing video games. But every time our hands brushed, or our eyes met, there was this quiet awareness between us. The moments we shared in the cabin didn't stay there. They followed us. They lived in the space between conversations, and the silences we used to ignore. One night, about a week after the trip, he came over to my place. We didn't plan anything big. We ordered pizza, like we'd done 100 times before, and sat on the couch, legs touching, watching some mindless movie we both already seen. But somewhere in the middle of it, I turned to him and said, "I miss it." He looked at me, confused. Miss what? The quiet. The cabin. Waking up next to you. His expression softened. Yeah, he said. Me too. And that's when it happened. Not like a scene from a movie. Not with dramatic music or a perfect camera angle. Just two people sitting close on a worn-out couch, finally tired of pretending. He leaned in first. Slow, hesitant, giving me every chance to stop it. But I didn't. I met him halfway. And when our lips touched for the first time, it wasn't fireworks. It was more like a deep sigh, like something inside both of us had been holding its breath for too long, and it finally got to exhale. The kiss was soft, careful, but it said everything. That this wasn't a phase. That it hadn't been just the cabin. That this was real, and it had always been waiting for us to find it. Afterward, we didn't rush into labels or declarations. We didn't make promises we weren't ready to keep. We just sat there, fingers laced together, letting the silence hold us. Letting the moment be enough. In the weeks that followed, we started showing up differently. Not hiding, not explaining ourselves, just being. Some people noticed. Some didn't. A few asked questions. A few looked twice. But none of it mattered. Not really. Because we knew. And we had each other. That was more than enough. He wore my pajama shirt again one night. On purpose this time. I walked into my room, saw him standing there, grinning like he was trying to be smug, and I couldn't help but laugh. That's officially yours now, I said. Good, he replied. I was hoping it would be. I walked over, wrapped my arms around him, and rested my chin on his shoulder. He leaned into me like he'd always belonged there. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't been able to admit before. It wasn't just about the trip, or the shared bed, or the forgotten pajamas. It was about every quiet moment that followed. Every look, every touch, every truth we slowly gave each other piece by piece. We hadn't fallen in love overnight. We had grown into it, tenderly, cautiously, with all the fear and hope and beauty that came with letting someone in. And now that we had, there was no going back. There didn't need to be, because what we had built, slowly, softly, honestly, was something worth holding on to. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of where it would go. Because no matter what came next, we were in it together. And together was exactly where I wanted to be. If this story touched your heart even a little, don't forget to hit the like button. It helps more people find this beautiful journey. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, full of emotion, connection, and truth. And let us know in the comments. Have you ever felt something deeper with someone you didn't expect? We read every story, and your words matter here. Share this video with someone who needs to feel something real today. Speech Balloon Red Heart.